I didn't cry when my grandfather died. Not because I didn't love him, but because everything happened too fast, too quiet, too controlled. Within hours, my aunt took charge of everything, the house, the documents, the calls, even the way we were allowed to grieve. By the next day, she was already talking about burial plans. Closed casket. No delays. No questions. Everyone said grief makes people act strangely. But this wasn't grief. This was urgency. And beneath it, fear. My grandfather had spent his entire life building something carefully. Businesses, savings, trusts, measured in millions of dollars. He believed in transparency, in rules, in time. Yet 48 hours after his death, my aunt was determined to put him in the ground before anyone could look too closely. I stayed silent. Not because I was weak, but because silence gave me time. And time, as I would learn, was exactly what the truth needed to surface, publicly, legally, and in a way no one could bury again. If you're listening from somewhere right now, I'd love to know, where are you and what time is it there? And if stories about patience, truth, and delayed justice resonate with you, consider subscribing. Some stories don't need shouting, just witnesses. The call came just after sunrise. I remember because the light hadn't fully reached the kitchen yet and the coffee machine was still warming up when my phone vibrated against the counter. My aunt's name flashed on the screen. I didn't answer at first. Something in my chest tightened before I even knew why. When I did pick up, her voice was composed, too composed. She said Grandpa had passed in his sleep sometime during the night. Natural causes. Peaceful. Those were her words. She spoke like someone reading a prepared statement, not like a daughter who had just lost her father. I asked where she was calling from. She said, "The house. I'm taking care of things." That phrase would repeat itself often in the days ahead. Taking care of things. As if grief were a checklist. I drove over an hour later. The house looked unchanged from the outside. Same white siding, same maple tree Grandpa used to prune every spring, same driveway where he had taught me how to parallel park. But inside everything felt rearranged, not physically but emotionally. The air was heavy, like a room where decisions had already been made without you. My aunt greeted me with a brief hug. No tears, no shaking hands. She led me to the living room where folders were already stacked neatly on the coffee table. Legal folders. The kind you don't pull out on the morning someone dies unless you've been waiting to. She told me Grandpa had named her executor years ago. I knew that much was true. She had always been the organized one, the responsible one, or at least that's how she liked to present herself. She worked in real estate, talked confidently about contracts, deadlines, leverage. Grandpa trusted her with paperwork, but he trusted me with conversations, with thoughts he didn't put on paper. He used to tell me stories late at night when insomnia hit him, about mistakes he'd made, about money he'd lost and earned back, about how family could turn strange when numbers got too big. He said it calmly, like a man who had already seen the ending once and didn't want an encore. That morning, my aunt explained that there would be no long waiting period. She'd already contacted a funeral home. Burial within 48 hours. She said it was what Grandpa would have wanted. I didn't argue. I nodded. I watched. Silence felt safer than resistance. As more relatives arrived, she positioned herself carefully near the door, near the phone, always in control of who knew what. When someone asked about the will, she said it was being handled. When someone suggested waiting a few days for extended family to arrive, she said delays were unnecessary. When I asked whether an autopsy had been considered, she looked at me for the first time with something sharp behind her eyes. "Why would we do that?" she asked. "He was old. This happens." It does, I thought. But not like this. I spent most of the day in the background. I refilled coffee cups. I answered condolences with short sentences. I listened. Silence, I was learning, made people careless. They filled it with their own words. Late in the afternoon, while others were distracted, I wandered into Grandpa's study. The door was slightly ajar, but the desk drawers were closed. Too neatly closed. Grandpa was meticulous, but not sterile. He left notes. He left receipts. He left things half-finished. I opened the bottom drawer. Empty. The file cabinet beside the desk was locked. It hadn't been before. I knew because I'd helped him organize it just months earlier. Trust documents. Property records. Statements. Everything had been labeled in his careful handwriting. I didn't force anything. I didn't ask. I simply noted it. That night, as I was preparing to leave, my aunt handed me a single sheet of paper. She said it was a standard acknowledgement of death, nothing binding, just a formality. I read every line before signing. My name was spelled correctly. The date was correct. The wording was vague but legal. I signed, slowly. Driving home, exhaustion finally caught up with me. Grief arrived late, like it needed privacy to exist. But underneath it was something else, a steady, unsettling awareness that I was standing at the edge of a story I didn't yet understand. Over the next day, messages came in waves. The funeral home confirmation, the burial schedule, the attorney's office appointment. My aunt said she would attend on behalf of the family. She never asked if I wanted to come. That was when I began to pay attention to the numbers. Grandpa's estate wasn't a mystery. He had been open about it, in principle, if not in detail. Multiple rental properties, a small logistics company he'd founded decades earlier, retirement accounts, trusts for grandchildren. The total value wasn't something we talked about openly, but I knew it crossed into the millions. Money like that attracts gravity. It pulls people inward. It changes how quickly they move. The burial date was set for the following morning. Still no autopsy. Still no reading of the will. Still no chance to breathe. I thought about calling a lawyer then. I didn't. Not yet. Accusations require certainty, and certainty requires patience. Instead, I did what Grandpa had taught me to do when something didn't add up. I gathered information quietly. I requested copies of documents I was entitled to as a beneficiary. I checked dates. I compared signatures from older records I had at home. I didn't confront my aunt when she deflected. I let her assume I was grieving, distracted, uninvolved. That assumption would become her greatest mistake. Because while she was busy arranging a burial, I was learning how quickly a truth can disappear if no one insists on slowing down. And I was beginning to understand why Grandpa had always warned me. Sometimes the most dangerous moment isn't when someone dies, but when everyone else rushes to move on. The morning of the funeral arrived with a kind of artificial calm, the kind that feels rehearsed. The sky was clear, almost offensively blue, as if the day itself refused to acknowledge what had happened. I arrived early not because I wanted to be there, but because being late felt like surrendering whatever little control I still had. The funeral home smelled like polished wood and something floral meant to soothe. My aunt was already there, standing near the front desk, speaking in a low, efficient voice. She held a clipboard like a shield. When she saw me, she nodded once, then turned back to the director without missing a beat. No greeting, no shared silence, just procedure. The casket was closed. That had been decided before anyone else arrived. I stood a few feet away from it, trying to reconcile the finality of the box with the speed at which we had arrived here. Less than 48 hours. No vigil, no pause. Grandpa had always believed that endings deserved time. He used to say that rushing a goodbye was a kind of disrespect even when it was unintentional. Relatives trickled in, whispering condolences, offering hugs that lingered a second too long or not long enough. I noticed how often people glanced at my aunt before speaking, as if checking for permission. She had positioned herself near the aisle, close enough to intercept questions, far enough from the casket to avoid being cornered by emotion. When someone asked whether there would be a viewing later, she answered smoothly, "No." Grandpa was very clear. He wanted it simple. She said it with such confidence that no one challenged her. I wondered who Grandpa had told that to. He hadn't told me. The service itself was brief. Too brief. A few words from the officiant, a handful of rehearsed memories. Nothing about the years Grandpa spent building something from nothing. Nothing about the way he measured success in patience, not profit. It felt less like a farewell and more like a formality that needed to be checked off before something else could begin. I sat in the second row, hands folded, listening more than mourning. Grief had a way of sharpening my attention instead of dulling it. I noticed how my aunt never sat down. How she checked her watch twice during the service. How her phone vibrated silently in her hand, and how she glanced at the screen before slipping it back into her pocket. Afterward, at the gravesite, the urgency became even more visible. The burial crew moved quickly, efficiently, as if they had been instructed not to linger. The officiant offered final words. The casket was lowered. Dirt followed. People shifted uncomfortably, unsure when it was appropriate to leave. My aunt thanked everyone for coming. She mentioned paperwork, logistics, next steps, words that didn't belong in that moment. When someone suggested gathering later to talk things through, she smiled tightly and said, "We'll handle that soon." Soon. Another word she used like a lock. As people began to disperse, I stayed behind for a moment, staring at the fresh mound of earth. The finality hit me then, not as a wave, but as a weight. Grandpa was gone, and whatever questions remained were now officially inconvenient. On my way back to the car, my aunt caught up with me. She handed me another envelope. Inside were copies of documents, summaries, not originals, estate overview, executor confirmation, everything dated recently, too recently. Just so you're informed, she said. Her tone was neutral, professional. I'll be taking care of distributions once everything is finalized. I asked carefully whether there had been any changes to Grandpa's will. She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Then she said minor updates. Nothing that affects you. I didn't ask what those updates were. Not then. Silence again felt like the better choice. That evening I spread the papers across my kitchen table. I compared them to older copies Grandpa had given me months before, insisting I keep them just in case. The differences were subtle but unmistakable. A trust amendment dated 3 days before his death. A change in beneficiary percentages. Language tightened in ways Grandpa usually avoided. Most concerning was the timing. The amendment was notarized, witnessed, legal on its face. But Grandpa had been hospitalized during that window. Sedated. Weak. I checked the witness names. Both were associated with my aunt's real estate office. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding, not with anger but with a growing clarity. This wasn't chaos. This was choreography. Over the next few hours, I pulled bank statements, property records, anything publicly accessible. I wasn't looking for proof yet. I was mapping patterns. Transfers initiated but not completed. Accounts consolidated unusually fast. A burial rushed before legal questions could surface. It dawned on me then that timing wasn't just emotional, it was legal. Certain challenges became more complicated once burial occurred. Certain examinations required court orders. Certain truths became harder to reach the deeper someone was buried. I understood the urgency now. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind was assembling pieces faster than my emotions could catch up. Grandpa's warnings echoed in my head, no longer abstract. Family does turn strange when numbers get too big. The next morning, my aunt called to check in. She asked how I was holding up. Her voice was softer now, almost kind. I told her I was tired. She offered reassurance, said everything would be taken care of, that I didn't need to worry. I thanked her, hung up, and wrote down every detail of the conversation. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. I wasn't ready to accuse. I was ready to wait. Because if there was one thing Grandpa had taught me better than anyone else, it was this: when someone rushes to close a door, it's usually because they're afraid of what might walk through if it stays open. And I had a feeling the truth was already knocking. I gave myself exactly 1 day to grieve properly. I stayed home. I turned off my phone. I let the silence stretch without trying to fill it. I thought about Grandpa's laugh, the way it came from deep in his chest. I thought about how he used to double-check numbers, not because he didn't trust people, but because he trusted systems more than intentions. When that day ended, I folded my grief into something quieter and more useful. Focus. The next morning, I began with what I knew. Grandpa had always believed in redundancy. If something matters, he used to say, you don't store it in one place. Over the years, he had shown me fragments of his system, not because I was special, but because I listened. He trusted listeners. I logged into the financial portals he had once authorized me to access for emergencies. Most of the accounts were still there. Rental income, retirement funds, a brokerage account that hadn't been touched in months. On the surface, everything looked normal. That in itself was suspicious. Then I noticed what wasn't there. One trust account, one he had mentioned specifically when talking about long-term planning, was missing from the primary dashboard. Not closed, not zeroed out, just absent. I cross-checked the account number from an old printed statement. When I searched directly, it appeared. Active. Recently modified. The modification date made my stomach tighten. 2 days before Grandpa died, I pulled the document history. A trust amendment had been uploaded electronically. I read it slowly, line by line. The language was technically sound, but the tone felt wrong. Grandpa wrote plainly. This was polished, strategic, aggressive, in places where he had always been cautious. The distribution percentages had shifted. Significantly. My aunt's share increased. Mine remained unchanged, but a secondary clause redirected future earnings under conditions that had never existed before. Conditions that conveniently placed control squarely in her hands. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't an emotional reaction anymore. It was a logistical one. Someone had anticipated challenges and prepared for them. I printed everything. Next came the real estate records. Grandpa owned 4 rental properties outright and held partial ownership in 2 commercial buildings. Property transfers take time. Paper trails, public records. I searched county databases. No transfers yet, but liens had been filed, administrative ones. Temporary but purposeful. Designed to delay inquiries, not finalize outcomes. It was clever, effective, and unmistakably intentional. By midday, my kitchen table looked like a planning room. Papers sorted by category. Dates highlighted. Names circled. Patterns emerging. I wasn't trying to prove wrongdoing yet. I was trying to understand the playbook. One detail kept resurfacing: timing. Every questionable action occurred within a narrow window, just before Grandpa's death or immediately after. Nothing months earlier. Nothing gradual. It was as if someone had been waiting for a signal. I remembered something Grandpa had said during his last hospital stay. He was tired, drifting in and out, but lucid enough to grip my hand and say, "If anything happens too fast, slow it down." At the time, I thought he was talking about medical decisions. Now I wasn't so sure. In the afternoon, I did something I hadn't planned to do so soon. I called the bank branch where Grandpa had done most of his in-person business. I didn't accuse. I didn't speculate. I asked procedural questions. What authorizations existed? What documentation had been submitted recently? The representative was polite, careful. She told me she couldn't disclose specifics without formal authority, but she did confirm one thing that mattered. Grandpa had not personally visited the branch in the week before his death. Any changes had been submitted electronically or by proxy. By proxy. I thanked her and hung up. My hands were steady. My thoughts were not. That evening, my aunt texted me. She asked if I had found everything I needed in the documents she'd provided. The question felt rehearsed. I replied that I was still reviewing things and appreciated her thoroughness. She responded with a smile emoji. It was the first time she'd ever used one with me. I knew then that she believed the window was closing. That burial had sealed something. That silence equaled acceptance. She didn't know I wasn't silent. I was simply choosing where to speak. Over the next 2 days, I gathered what I could without crossing legal boundaries. Copies of hospital visitation logs. Not full medical records, just timestamps. Grandpa had been sedated during the exact window the trust amendment was signed. I checked notary availability records. The notary listed was active, but the location field was vague. Off-site. No address. I compiled everything into a timeline. When I finished, the picture was clear enough to scare me, not because of what it showed, but because of how carefully it had been constructed. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision fueled by grief. This was a plan that assumed no one would look closely, that no one would wait long enough to connect details. I finally did what I should have done earlier. I scheduled a consultation with a probate attorney. I chose him deliberately. Someone with no connection to my aunt's professional circles, someone older, methodical, known for asking uncomfortable questions. I didn't send documents ahead of time. I wanted to see his reaction in real time. When I laid everything out on his desk, he didn't speak for several minutes. He read, compared signatures, checked dates. When he finally looked up, his expression wasn't dramatic, it was focused. "Who benefits most from the speed of these decisions?" he asked. I answered without hesitation. He nodded. "Then we slow things down." He explained the process carefully. Probate court, injunctions, forensic review, the possibility of exhumation if necessary. None of it was quick, none of it was easy, but all of it was possible. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I thought of Grandpa, of his warnings, of my aunt's confidence, of the way everyone had rushed to move on. "I want the truth," I said, "and I want it in public." The lawyer leaned back. "Then we'll need patience and silence." I smiled just slightly. Silence I could do, because by then I understood something my aunt didn't. She thought the burial had ended the story. In reality, it had just fixed the timeline. And timelines, once fixed, have a way of exposing everything that doesn't belong. I didn't tell anyone about the lawyer. Not my relatives, not my friends, not even the one cousin who had quietly asked me after the funeral whether everything felt a little off. I nodded when people spoke. I thanked them for their concern. I let my aunt believe what she wanted to believe, that I was grieving, overwhelmed, and grateful she was handling everything. Silence became my strategy. In the days that followed, my aunt grew more visible. She sent group emails updating the family on progress. She scheduled meetings with accountants. She spoke confidently about timelines and distributions, using words like efficiency and closure as if they were virtues rather than warnings. I watched from a distance. Every message she sent became a data point. Every reassurance, a signal. She mentioned that some accounts were being consolidated to simplify things. She said certain properties might be sold quickly to avoid complications. She emphasized how stressful the process was for her, how much responsibility she was carrying alone. Responsibility, I noticed, was her favorite shield. Meanwhile, I did very little outwardly. I didn't challenge decisions. I didn't ask to see originals. I didn't demand meetings. Instead, I documented dates, times, language, who was copied on what. When she said already approved, I asked myself by whom and when. People assume silence means agreement. It doesn't. It means observation. One afternoon, she invited me to her office, said she wanted to walk me through things so I wouldn't feel left out. I accepted. Declining would have raised questions. Her office was sleek, modern, glass walls, neutral colors, certificates framed precisely. She spoke the entire time we sat there, flipping through binders, pointing at summaries rather than details. She didn't notice that I wasn't looking where she pointed. I was watching her hands, how she hesitated before certain pages, how she skipped others entirely. She explained that Grandpa had wanted her to take control quickly, that he'd been worried about disputes, that the amendments were meant to protect the estate. She said my name often, as if including me verbally could substitute for including me substantively. I nodded, asked simple questions, neutral ones, nothing accusatory. When I left, she hugged me. It was the first time she had done that since Grandpa died. Her grip lingered a second too long. "Trust me," she said softly. "I've got this." I believed her. She did have it right up until she didn't. That night, I forwarded everything she'd shown me to my lawyer. Not the documents themselves, just notes, observations, the gaps between what she said and what existed on paper. He replied with one sentence, "She's getting comfortable. Comfort breeds mistakes." Over the next week, small inconsistencies began to surface. My aunt authorized a transfer from one account before probate had formally opened. She explained it away as administrative. She signed as executor on a document that predated the court's confirmation. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was assuming no one would check. That assumption was expensive. My lawyer prepared quietly. He filed a request with the probate court for a preliminary review. No accusations, no allegations, just a procedural pause. An injunction to prevent asset movement until documentation could be verified. The court scheduled a hearing. When my aunt received the notice, she called me immediately. Her voice was tight, controlled, but strained around the edges. "Do you know anything about this?" she asked. I paused before answering, just long enough to let the silence speak. "I assumed you did," I said. "You're the executor." She exhaled sharply. "Told me it was probably routine, a formality. Said she'd handle it." I believed her again. Because the thing about truth is that it doesn't require belief to function. It only requires time. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. Not from fear, but from anticipation. This wasn't the explosion yet. This was the pressure building before it. The moment when silence becomes visible. In the courtroom the next morning, my aunt arrived early. She wore a tailored suit, neutral colors, authority stitched into every seam. She greeted people confidently as if she belonged there. When she saw me, she smiled wide, reassuring, the smile of someone who thought they were still ahead. I sat quietly beside my lawyer. I didn't bring a folder. I didn't bring notes. Everything I needed was already filed. When the judge entered, the room shifted. Formality replaced performance. My aunt straightened. I stayed still. The judge asked procedural questions. Names, roles. My aunt answered smoothly. My lawyer requested a temporary freeze on the estate pending verification of recent amendments. He spoke calmly, factually, no emotion, just sequence. My aunt objected. Politely, confidently, she explained the urgency of settling affairs, the importance of respecting Grandpa's wishes. She spoke about family harmony. The judge listened, then asked one question. Why were these amendments executed while the decedent was hospitalized and sedated? The room went very quiet. My aunt hesitated. Just for a moment. but it was enough. She said Grandpa was lucid, that everything was legal, that witnesses were present. The judge nodded and requested documentation, originals, verification. Not later, immediately. The hearing was continued. Outside the courtroom, my aunt confronted me. Not angrily. Not yet. She asked why I hadn't told her I had concerns, why I hadn't come to her first. I met her eyes. Calm. Measured. I didn't want to accuse anyone, I said. I wanted clarity. She studied me as if seeing me for the first time. Then she smiled again, but this one didn't reach her eyes. You should be careful, she said quietly. These things can get messy. I nodded. That's why I waited. She walked away without another word. In the days that followed, the tone changed. Emails stopped. Phone calls went unanswered. Information slowed. Assets that had been moving suddenly froze. Silence had shifted sides. My lawyer called me late one evening. He told me the court had authorized a forensic review of the documents. Signatures, notary logs, witness statements. He told me this was no longer a simple probate matter. It's becoming something else, he said. I looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. I thought of Grandpa again, of his patience, of his trust in systems. Good, I said. Let it become what it is. Because by then, I wasn't trying to win anything. I was letting the truth do what it always does when no one rushes it. Unfold. The lawyer's office was quiet in the way only experienced places are. No ringing phones, no rushed footsteps, no unnecessary decoration. Everything had a purpose. Even the silence felt deliberate. I sat across from him as he spread copies of the trust amendment across his desk, aligning them with older documents Grandpa had signed years before. He didn't rush. He never did. Instead, he placed 2 pages side by side and tapped them gently with his pen. Most people think fraud is loud, he said. It usually isn't. It's subtle. It hides in familiarity. He pointed to the signatures. At first glance, they looked identical. Same looping G, same firm underline. But then he showed me how the pressure changed, how the downstrokes were weaker, how the spacing drifted slightly to the right. Medication does this, he said. So does fatigue, sometimes fear. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, not sadness, but confirmation. The kind that settles in slowly and leaves no room for denial. He explained the next steps carefully. The court had ordered a forensic document examiner to review the amendment. Not just the signature, but the metadata. Timestamps, device origin, IP logs. Every digital fingerprint leaves a trace, especially when someone assumes no one will look. Your aunt assumed urgency would protect her, he said. Urgency is the enemy of scrutiny. But once scrutiny begins, urgency becomes suspicious. I nodded. I had seen that shift already. He also explained the notary issue. Off-site notarizations weren't illegal, but they were risky, especially when the location wasn't documented. Especially when the witnesses had professional ties to the primary beneficiary. Especially when the person signing was hospitalized. On their own, each detail is explainable, he said. Together they tell a story. That word story lingered. Before I left, he asked me a question I hadn't expected. Are you prepared for this to become public? I thought about the courtroom, about my aunt's confidence cracking just enough for others to notice, about family members who had avoided eye contact since the hearing notice went out. Yes, I said. That's the point. He nodded once. Then don't change how you're behaving. Let her keep underestimating you. Over the next week, I did exactly that. I responded politely to texts when they came. I didn't push when they didn't. I continued acting like someone on the periphery, informed but not involved. Meanwhile, the review moved quickly, faster than I expected. The forensic examiner confirmed what my lawyer had suspected. The amendment had been signed during a window when Grandpa's medical records indicated heavy sedation. The signature matched his in form, but not in execution. The notary's log showed inconsistencies. The IP address used to upload the document traced back to a device registered to my aunt's office. None of it was conclusive on its own. Together, it was devastating. The judge scheduled another hearing. This one wasn't labeled procedural. This one had teeth. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt different. Reporters weren't present yet, but the energy had shifted. Word travels fast in legal circles. A routine probate dispute doesn't draw attention. A contested amendment involving millions does. My aunt arrived later this time. Her suit was sharper, her smile tighter. She didn't greet me. She didn't have to. We both knew the distance had grown permanent. Inside the courtroom, the judge didn't waste time. He summarized the findings calmly, methodically. Each sentence landed like a measured blow. Signature inconsistencies, medical timelines, notary discrepancies, digital upload origins. My aunt's attorney objected, requested time, asked for consideration. The judge listened, then leaned forward slightly. Given the circumstances, he said this court is authorizing further investigation, including financial audits and, if necessary, involvement from appropriate authorities. Appropriate authorities. The words echoed in the room. My aunt's composure slipped not dramatically but noticeably. Her hands clenched, her gaze fixed on the bench, not in confidence but calculation. She was already adjusting, already planning her next move. Outside the courtroom, family members gathered in small clusters. Whispers replaced greetings. Questions hung unanswered. I stood apart, not out of avoidance but out of habit. Silence had become my posture. One cousin approached me quietly, asked if I knew this would happen. I told her I didn't know anything, only that Grandpa had always believed in clarity. That afternoon the call came. My lawyer told me the financial audit had uncovered irregular transfers, small amounts at first, then larger ones. Money moving through intermediary accounts, delayed just enough to avoid immediate detection, designed to activate once probate closed. Your aunt didn't just plan for the amendment, he said. She planned for the aftermath. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief, not satisfaction, just inevitability. He also told me something else, something heavier. The medical examiner had been contacted, not to accuse, to review. Given the timing, the sedation levels, the absence of an autopsy, I asked what that meant. It means the court wants certainty, he said, about everything. That night I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, city humming beyond the windows. I thought about Grandpa's last days, his tired eyes, his steady grip when he'd told me to slow things down. I wondered whether he had sensed this coming, whether he had trusted that someone would wait long enough to see it through. The next morning, my aunt called me for the first time in days. Her voice was controlled but no longer smooth. "This has gone far enough," she said. "We can settle this privately." I listened, didn't interrupt. She spoke about misunderstandings, about stress, about intentions being misread. She suggested mediation, compromise, family over courts. When she finished, I took a breath. "I never wanted a fight," I said. "I wanted the truth." There was a pause, longer than any before. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "No," I said. "I'm letting the process finish." She hung up without another word. By the end of the week, the investigation expanded. Financial records flagged, accounts frozen. The phrase "potential criminal exposure" appeared in an email from my lawyer. It wasn't an explosion yet, but the ground had shifted. And for the first time since Grandpa died, I felt something lift, not the grief, not the loss, but the weight of waiting alone. Because now the silence wasn't just mine. It belonged to the truth. And it was getting louder. The third hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, but by Monday afternoon, everyone already knew it wouldn't be routine. The language in the court notice had changed, no longer procedural, no longer tentative. Words like expanded review, material discrepancies, and court-ordered examination replaced the softer phrasing from before. It was the kind of shift that made people sit up straighter without quite knowing why. I arrived early again, not out of nerves but habit. Waiting had become my way of thinking. The hallway outside the courtroom was quieter than before, but the quiet felt charged like a held breath. My lawyer stood beside me, reviewing nothing. He didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already on record. My aunt arrived 10 minutes before the session began. This time she wasn't alone. 2 attorneys flanked her, one older, one younger. Both looked alert, defensive. She didn't look at me at all. She didn't need to. Her posture said everything she wasn't saying. Inside the courtroom, the judge took his seat and immediately set the tone. "This court has reviewed the preliminary findings," he said, voice steady. "Today's purpose is clarification." Clarification was a polite word for what was coming. The judge began with the trust amendment. The forensic examiner's report was entered into the record. The examiner testified calmly, explaining pressure, variation, execution, anomalies, and inconsistencies between Grandpa's known signature patterns and the contested document. No accusations, just facts. My aunt's attorney cross-examined. suggested fatigue, age, natural variation. The examiner didn't argue. He simply explained margins of probability. Is it possible the decedent signed this document voluntarily? The attorney asked. Yes, the examiner said. Possible. Is it probable? The judge asked. No, the examiner replied. It is not. That word probable hung in the air longer than it should have. Next came the notary. She appeared via video, visibly uncomfortable. She confirmed her signature but hesitated when asked about location. Said she couldn't recall the exact place. Said she'd been contacted through a third party. Said she hadn't met Grandpa before that day. The judge asked who the third party was. She named my aunt's assistant. The room shifted. Then came the financial review. An auditor explained the transfer patterns, the staging accounts, the delays built into the system, how funds were positioned to move quickly once probate cleared. It was complex, but the conclusion was simple. This wasn't cleanup, it was preparation. My aunt's older attorney objected, arguing that planning didn't equal wrongdoing, that estate management often required foresight. The judge listened, then asked a single question. Why were these transfers initiated before probate authority was confirmed? No one answered immediately. My aunt's younger attorney spoke next, offering explanations about administrative overlap confusion during a stressful period miscommunication. The words felt thin, stretched. I watched my aunt as they spoke. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Her jaw was set. She wasn't panicking, not yet. She was calculating. Then my lawyer stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He laid out a timeline. Hospitalization, sedation records, trust amendment upload, notary contact, account staging, burial. Each step placed carefully in order like pieces of a mechanism designed to move one way. This isn't about grief, he said. It's about control and timing. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. For a moment, no one spoke. Then he issued his order. The estate would remain frozen. The amendment would be set aside pending further review. A full forensic audit would proceed. And he paused here, given the totality of circumstances. The court was referring the matter to external authorities for independent evaluation. My aunt's head snapped up. Your Honor, her attorney began. The judge raised a hand. This court is not making criminal findings today. It is making sure they are possible. That distinction mattered. It also changed everything. Outside the courtroom, the air felt heavier. Family members stood in clusters again, but this time the whispers were sharper. No one approached my aunt. No one approached me either. The space between us had become visible like a line drawn on the floor no one wanted to cross. My aunt caught up to me near the exit. This didn't have to happen, she said. Her voice was low, urgent now. You could have come to me. I met her gaze, calm, steady. I did, I said, in the only way I knew you'd hear. She stared at me, searching for something, guilt, fear, hesitation. She didn't find it. You think this ends well? She asked. I thought of Grandpa, of his warnings, of the way he trusted systems because systems, unlike people, left records. I think it ends truthfully, I said. She shook her head once sharply. You have no idea what you've started. She turned and walked away. That afternoon, my lawyer called with updates. External investigators had requested access to records already compiled. Banks had been notified. The medical examiner's office had agreed to a review given the timing and lack of an autopsy. This is no longer contained, he said. I thanked him and hung up. That evening, I received a message from a relative I hadn't heard from in years. She apologized for not asking questions earlier, for assuming everything was fine. She said Grandpa would be proud. I didn't reply right away. Pride wasn't what I was after. Closure wasn't either. I wanted alignment between what was said, what was done, and what was true. The next day, the first article appeared online. Not sensational, just factual. A local report about a contested estate involving significant assets and an ongoing investigation. No names yet, just outlines. My aunt's name would come later. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd first spread out Grandpa's papers, and felt something unfamiliar stillness. Not the tense silence of waiting, but the quiet of momentum moving without me pushing it. For weeks I had done almost nothing outwardly. I hadn't argued. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't accused. I had waited. Now the machinery of truth was turning on its own. And for the first time since the burial, I understood something clearly. The public moment wasn't coming. It had already begun. The involvement of outside authorities changed the temperature of everything. What had once been handled in conference rooms and private emails now moved through official channels, requests with letterheads, deadlines that couldn't be negotiated, questions that required sworn answers. The estate was no longer just a family matter. It had become a record. I felt that shift most clearly the morning my aunt's assistant called me by mistake. She hung up quickly, but not before I heard panic in her voice. Not anger, not frustration, panic. It confirmed what I already knew: the circle of control was shrinking. My lawyer called later that day. He told me the financial auditors had flagged several intermediary accounts tied indirectly to my aunt's business interests. Nothing illegal on its face, but unusual. Money had been moved in patterns designed to look temporary, holding positions that only made sense if someone expected the freeze to lift quickly. They assumed probate would close without resistance, he said. They planned for speed, not scrutiny. Speed again. Always speed. The medical review progressed just as quietly and just as thoroughly. Hospital records were examined. Sedation logs matched the timeline of the trust amendment. Nurses were interviewed. Doctors asked to clarify notes. No one accused anyone of wrongdoing. That wasn't their role. Their role was accuracy. Accuracy has a way of narrowing possibilities. My aunt stopped calling me altogether. When she did communicate, it was through attorneys. The tone had changed. No longer confident, no longer dismissive. Now it was defensive, procedural, every word chosen for how it might be read later. Family gatherings evaporated. Conversations paused when I entered rooms. Some relatives avoided me out of discomfort, others avoided me out of fear. I didn't blame them. This wasn't the kind of truth people like to witness up close. I stayed consistent, calm, polite, available but not explanatory. I had learned by then that over-explaining invited misinterpretation. Silence again did the work. The next court date arrived without ceremony. No press, no drama, just updates. The judge reviewed progress reports. Financial auditors confirmed irregularities were under deeper examination. The medical examiner stated that while no immediate conclusions were being drawn, the lack of an autopsy combined with the sedation timeline justified further review. My aunt's attorneys argued for restraint, for privacy, for family sensitivity. The judge responded evenly. Privacy does not override process, he said, and sensitivity does not negate obligation. It wasn't a condemnation. It was a boundary. Outside the courtroom, I stood alone while my lawyer spoke briefly with the auditors. My aunt passed by without acknowledging me. Her shoulders were tight, her stride shorter. She no longer looked like someone in control. She looked like someone managing delay. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. I received a call from a bank compliance officer. She identified herself carefully and explained that due to the investigation, they were required to notify beneficiaries of certain actions. She couldn't share details, but she did confirm one thing: an attempted transfer had been blocked earlier that morning. Blocked. The word landed softly, but its meaning was heavy. Someone had tried to move money. Recently. Despite the freeze, I relayed the information to my lawyer. He wasn't surprised. People reveal themselves when pressure peaks, he said. This tells us more than any document. Over the next 2 days, the investigation accelerated. Subpoenas were issued, emails requested, device records examined. The scope widened not because of suspicion, but because of necessity. When patterns emerge, you follow them. My aunt's assistant resigned, quietly. No announcement, no explanation. Then came the call that changed everything. My lawyer phoned late in the evening. His voice was steady, but I could hear the significance beneath it. The medical examiner is recommending a formal review of cause of death, he said. They're not calling it an exhumation yet, but they're preparing for that possibility. I sat down. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It hadn't been for a while. But hearing those words shifted something fundamental. The speed, the sedation, the burial. Pieces that had once seemed aggressive now felt strategic. What does that mean? I asked. It means the truth may require physical confirmation, he said. And if that happens, it will be public. Public, the word echoed. I thanked him and ended the call. I didn't cry. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt grounded. Heavy, but grounded. That night I dreamed of Grandpa. Not of his death, but of him standing in his study, adjusting papers on his desk unhurried. He looked up at me and smiled as if to say I was finally moving at the right pace. The next morning, the article updated. still cautious, still unnamed. But the language had sharpened. Expanded investigation, potential criminal implications, court oversight ongoing. My aunt's name was still absent, that I knew wouldn't last. She called me that afternoon, for the first time in weeks. No lawyers, no intermediaries. Her voice was low, controlled but fraying. "They're going too far," she said. "This is spiraling." I listened. Let her speak. She talked about intentions, about misunderstandings, about how Grandpa wouldn't have wanted this. She said family matters should stay private. She said mistakes had been made but not crimes. When she finished, there was a long pause. "You rushed him into the ground," I said quietly. "And you rushed the paperwork. If everything was clean, there would have been no reason to rush." She inhaled sharply. "You don't know what you're accusing me of," she said. "I'm not accusing you of anything," I replied. "I'm letting the record speak." Her voice hardened. "You think silence makes you innocent," I answered honestly. "I think it makes me accurate." She hung up. 2 days later, the court authorized the next step. The medical examiner formally requested permission to proceed with a deeper review, including potential exhumation, citing unresolved questions and legal necessity. The judge approved it. The order was clear, measured, final. When the news reached, the family reactions were immediate. Shock, anger, fear. Some called me demanding explanations. Others texted apologies. A few said nothing at all. I didn't respond to most of it, because by then something irreversible had happened. The truth had crossed a threshold. It no longer belonged to me or to my aunt or even to the family. It belonged to the process. And processes once engaged do not stop out of courtesy. They stop only when the facts are exhausted. And we were nowhere near that point yet. The 48 hours that followed the court's authorization felt unreal, not rushed, not chaotic, but suspended, as if time itself had decided to watch instead of interfere. Everyone knew what was coming. No one knew exactly what it would reveal. The exhumation was scheduled quietly without ceremony. No press allowed. Only officials, legal representatives, and the medical examiner's team. I wasn't required to be there. My lawyer advised against it, not out of fear, but out of practicality. There was nothing for me to witness that would change what was already in motion. So I waited. Waiting had become familiar territory. But this kind of waiting was different. It wasn't defensive anymore. It was anticipatory, like standing at the edge of something that had already decided to unfold. The call came the next evening. My lawyer didn't waste time with preambles. "They've completed the preliminary examination," he said, "and the findings raise serious concerns." I closed my eyes, not in dread but in readiness. He explained carefully. The toxicology results were inconsistent with the medical records. Sedatives present at levels that exceeded what had been charted. Not conclusive proof of intent, not yet, but enough to contradict the narrative of a peaceful natural passing. Combined with the timeline, he said, it changes the context. Context, another quiet word with enormous weight. Within hours, the investigation escalated. Law enforcement was formally notified. The probate case paused, overshadowed by something larger. Financial review, medical findings, digital records, all converging into a single, unavoidable question. Why the rush? That question echoed everywhere, in court filings, in hushed phone calls, in the way people avoided eye contact when they saw me. The next morning, the news broke. Not sensationally, not with accusations, just facts. A local outlet reported that an estate investigation had expanded following new medical findings related to the decedent's death. Authorities confirmed the review was ongoing. No names yet. No conclusions. But the truth had breached containment. My aunt's name appeared online by afternoon, not in headlines but in footnotes. Identified as executor, as beneficiary, as a person of interest in a complex legal matter. The language was careful, neutral, devastating, nonetheless. She didn't call me. Instead, her attorney requested a meeting. I declined. There was nothing left to negotiate. The following day, the court reconvened not for probate but for clarity. The judge addressed the assembled parties, his tone measured but firm. He acknowledged the findings. He acknowledged the implications. He emphasized restraint, due process, and the presumption of innocence. But he also said this: the sequence of actions surrounding the death, burial, and estate administration necessitates full transparency. Transparency had finally arrived. My aunt sat rigidly at her table. Her attorneys whispered urgently. She stared straight ahead, jaw tight, hands folded so carefully they looked rehearsed. She was no longer calculating. She was enduring. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Cameras, microphones, questions, shouted into the open air. I exited through a side door with my lawyer unnoticed. That was fine. I didn't need a stage. That evening my phone buzzed constantly. Messages from relatives, friends, people I hadn't heard from in years. Some apologized. Some demanded explanations. Some offered support they hadn't offered before. I answered none of them. Because the story had reached a point where words, mine, theirs, anyone's, no longer mattered as much as evidence. The next 48 hours were relentless. Search warrants were executed. Office records seized. Digital devices examined. Emails recovered. Financial pathways mapped in full. The pattern became undeniable. The trust amendment, the account staging, the attempted transfer during the freeze, the burial rush. It wasn't one decision. It was a chain. And chains once pulled apart reveal exactly where the strain was greatest. My aunt was questioned formally. Not arrested. Not charged. Questioned. She denied wrongdoing. Explained decisions as grief-driven administrative misunderstood. Claimed trust in advisors. Claimed love for her father. The investigators listened. They always do. But they also compare. By the end of the second day, the phrase, probable cause, entered the conversation. My lawyer called me late that night. They're preparing an announcement, he said. Tomorrow. I slept little. Not from anxiety, but from an unfamiliar stillness. The kind that comes when waiting is no longer required. The announcement came the next morning. A press conference. Brief. Controlled. Authorities confirmed that based on cumulative findings, charges were being considered related to financial fraud and potential misconduct surrounding the death. No details, no speculation. My aunt's name was spoken clearly. I watched the coverage alone, volume low, images muted. Her face appeared briefly older, somehow smaller. No defiance, no collapse, just exposure. That afternoon, my lawyer delivered the final update of the day. The probate court had issued an interim ruling. The original will, predating the amendment, would govern the estate pending final resolution. My aunt was removed as executor effective immediately. Grandpa's wishes, as originally written, were restored. I didn't celebrate. I didn't cry. I sat at my kitchen table, the same place where this had begun, and let the moment pass through me without resistance. Later that evening, a message arrived from my aunt. One sentence. No greeting. You destroyed everything. I read it once, then deleted it. Because the truth doesn't destroy, it reveals. And what can't survive revelation was never stable to begin with. In the days that followed, the noise slowly receded. Articles gave way to updates. Updates to silence. The investigation continued methodically, without urgency. And for the first time since Grandpa died, I felt something close to peace, not because justice was finished, but because it had finally started. The rush was over. The truth had arrived. And nothing, no burial, no document, no silence could bury it again. The day my aunt was formally confronted wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it seem. There were no raised voices, no sudden confessions, no handcuffs clicking in public view. What happened was quieter and somehow heavier than all of that. It took place in a government building I had passed dozens of times without noticing. Neutral walls, fluorescent lighting, a room designed to drain emotion from everything it touched. My lawyer advised me to attend, not because I was required to speak, but because presence mattered. Truth, when it finally surfaces, prefers witnesses. My aunt arrived with 2 attorneys. She looked composed, but the effort showed. Her movements were controlled to the point of stiffness. The confidence she once wore so easily now felt assembled like armor put on too late. The investigators began methodically. No accusations, no pressure, just questions. They walked her through the timeline again, slowly, carefully inviting her to explain each decision in her own words. Why the amendment was executed when it was. Why the witnesses were connected to her business. Why the notary couldn't place the location. Why funds were staged before probate authority was granted. Why an attempted transfer occurred after the freeze. At first, she answered smoothly. Grief, stress, delegation, trust in professionals, miscommunication. Then they introduced the documents. Email chains recovered from archived servers. Metadata from the amendment upload. Bank logs showing authorization attempts tied to her credentials. Medical records aligned precisely with the signing window. Each new piece didn't contradict her story outright. It narrowed it. She began to pause longer before answering, asked to repeat questions, asked for clarification where none was needed. Her attorneys interjected more frequently, their confidence thinning with each interruption. At one point, an investigator placed two documents side by side in front of her. "Can you explain why this authorization appears to have been generated from your office device at 2:14 a.m.?" he asked. She stared at the page. "Too long. I don't remember," she said finally. The room stayed quiet. Another investigator spoke next. "Can you explain why the same device accessed Grandpa's trust portal less than 30 minutes later?" Her jaw tightened. "I had access," she said. "I was the executor." "Yes," he replied, "but you were not yet confirmed by the court." That distinction landed hard. I watched her then, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a strange detachment. This wasn't the woman who had controlled the funeral, who had spoken with authority and speed. This was someone facing the consequences of having mistaken urgency for immunity. The questions continued. When they brought up the burial timing, she bristled, said she was honoring her father's wishes, said delays would have been cruel. When they asked why no autopsy was considered, she said there was no reason. The medical examiner's findings were introduced next. Sedative levels, chart discrepancies, expert interpretation. Still no accusations, but the room shifted again. Her attorneys requested a brief recess. It was granted. During the break, my aunt didn't look at me. She sat rigidly, hands clasped, staring at the floor. For a moment I wondered if she would say something, anything to me. She didn't. When the questioning resumed, the tone changed. Not harsher, sharper. The investigators laid out the full sequence, how the estate would have transferred cleanly, had no one intervened, how the burial timing limited immediate challenges, how the staged accounts were positioned to activate automatically. "This is a pattern," one of them said. "Patterns don't require intent to exist, they only require repetition." Her defense shifted then, from explanation to denial. She denied wrongdoing, denied manipulation, denied knowledge of certain actions, even when the evidence placed them directly in her control. Her attorneys objected repeatedly. The investigators noted each objection, then continued. After hours of questioning, the session ended. No charges announced. Not yet. But something irrevocable had happened. Her version of events no longer stood alone. Outside the building, cameras waited. Questions shouted. Names spoken. My aunt exited through a different door. I left quietly, my lawyer beside me. As we walked, he said only one thing. "They have what they need." The days that followed were heavy with anticipation. Formal notices arrived. Asset seizures initiated. Additional accounts frozen. A grand jury convened to review findings related to financial fraud. The medical investigation remained open, its language careful but unmistakably serious. My aunt's name appeared in headlines now, not sensationalized but undeniable. I received one final call from her attorney. He asked if I would consider a statement supporting a reduced narrative, emphasizing family conflict rather than misconduct. He spoke in careful phrases as if words could still redirect gravity. I declined. "I didn't bring this forward," I said. "The record did." He didn't argue. Family reactions fractured completely after that. Some relatives cut contact. Others reached out with apologies that arrived months too late. A few admitted they had suspected something, but hadn't wanted to know. I understood, knowing Carrie's responsibility. One evening I visited Grandpa's house alone. The court had granted temporary access to retrieve personal items. The rooms felt smaller without him, quieter. I stood in his study, running my fingers along the edge of the desk where he used to sit. I found a notebook in the back of a drawer. Not financial, personal. Pages filled with observations about people, about patience, about time. One line stood out. "Truth doesn't need urgency. It needs room." I closed the notebook and felt something settle inside me. The final confrontation hadn't been loud. It hadn't been satisfying in the way revenge stories are. It had been slow, deliberate, and public enough to matter. My aunt wasn't exposed because I accused her. She was exposed because she rushed, and in doing so, she left behind a trail she believed no one would follow. The legal process would continue. Outcomes would be decided by people with titles and authority and distance. That was as it should be. My role was finished. I had waited. I had watched. I had allowed the truth to arrive on its own terms. and when it did, I didn't need to say a word. Justice didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, court orders, sealed envelopes, quiet phone calls, each one removing another layer of uncertainty. By the time the probate court reconvened to finalize interim decisions, the outcome no longer felt dramatic. It felt inevitable. The courtroom was fuller than it had been in weeks, not because of spectacle but because clarity draws people back. Relatives who had avoided proceedings now sat quietly in the back rows. Attorneys shuffled papers without urgency. The judge reviewed the record with a patience that mirrored the pace of the entire process. He summarized the findings without commentary. The trust amendment was invalidated. The original will was reinstated in full. My aunt was permanently removed as executor and barred from any fiduciary role related to the estate. A special administrator was appointed to oversee distributions under court supervision. There was no gavel slam, no audible reaction, just the soft sound of pens moving as the clerk recorded decisions that had been months in the making. When the judge looked up, his gaze settled briefly on me, not as a participant, but as a witness to completion. "These proceedings are concluded," he said. "Further matters will proceed through appropriate channels." Appropriate channels. Again. Outside the hallway buzzed softly. Some relatives approached me hesitantly. A few thanked me. Others simply nodded, eyes lowered as if acknowledging a truth they hadn't wanted to face earlier. I didn't correct anyone. Gratitude and guilt often sound similar. Both pass. My lawyer shook my hand. "You did exactly what you needed to do," he said. "By doing almost nothing." That afternoon, the special administrator began the slow work of restoring order. Accounts were unfrozen methodically, properties inventoried, trusts reactivated under their original terms. It wasn't fast. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. And for the first time since Grandpa died, I felt the absence of urgency. Weeks passed. The criminal investigation continued separately beyond my involvement. I wasn't asked to testify again. My documentation had already spoken. The process moved forward without me as it should. The estate distributions followed the original will. Grandpa's intentions, clear, measured, patient, were honored exactly as he had written them years earlier. Funds designated for education were restored. Long-term trusts reinstated. Charitable contributions resumed. Nothing extravagant, nothing vengeful, just alignment. One evening, as I reviewed the final accounting, I noticed something small but significant. Grandpa had left a modest sum aside, not labeled, not explained, just a note in his handwriting for whoever waits. I closed the folder and sat quietly for a long time. The family dynamic didn't heal overnight. Some relationships remained strained, others dissolved entirely. That was beyond the court's reach. Justice can correct records, not feelings. My aunt remained absent. Her name appeared occasionally in updates, motions filed, responses, submitted, timelines extended. I didn't follow them closely. Her story had diverged from mine. Our paths no longer intersected. One afternoon, I returned to the house one last time. The maple tree still stood in the yard, leaves turning slowly. I walked through each room without hurry, letting memories surface and settle. In the study, I placed Grandpa's notebook back in the drawer where I'd found it. Some things don't need to travel. Before leaving, I stood by the front door and looked back once more. The house felt lighter, not emptied but resolved. Outside, the air was cool, measured, honest. As I drove away, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt upright, like someone who had been leaning for a long time and finally stood straight without effort. Justice hadn't come because I demanded it. It had come because I waited long enough for the truth to finish speaking. And in that waiting, something else had happened. I had learned the quiet power of restraint, the strength of letting systems work, of trusting that facts given time organize themselves. Grandpa used to say that integrity isn't proven in moments of action, but in moments of pause, when you could act but choose to observe. Now I understood. The story that began with a rushed burial ended with a careful restoration. Not of money, not of reputation, but of order, of sequence, of truth. And that, I knew, was the justice he would have wanted. The months after everything settled were quieter than I expected. Not empty, just calm, in a way that felt unfamiliar. For so long, my life had been shaped by waiting, by watching systems move, by resisting the urge to react before the truth was ready. When the legal process finally stepped out of my daily life, I had to relearn how to exist without that constant vigilance. The criminal case against my aunt continued somewhere beyond my reach. I received no updates unless they were strictly necessary. I didn't ask for them. At some point, justice stops being something you observe and becomes something you release. What mattered to me had already been resolved. The estate was fully restored under Grandpa's original will. The special administrator completed distributions carefully, transparently, and without drama. Trusts were funded exactly as Grandpa intended. Education accounts protected long-term investments, secured charitable commitments, honored down to the last dollar. No one celebrated. There were no family dinners to mark the moment. No reconciliation speeches. Just quiet confirmations in writing signatures at the bottom of pages that finally aligned with the man Grandpa had been. I returned to my own routine slowly. Work, grocery runs, evenings that no longer ended with document review or legal calls. At first, the normalcy felt undeserved, like I was moving on too easily. Then I realized something important. Moving on wasn't forgetting. It was accepting that the story had reached its proper ending. One afternoon, I met with the special administrator for a final procedural handoff. As we reviewed the closing file, he paused and looked at me. "You know," he said, "most cases like this don't end cleanly. They dissolve into settlements." Silence, everyone agreeing not to ask more questions. I nodded. I had seen how close that outcome had been. "This one didn't," he continued, "because someone was patient. Patient." The word followed me home. That evening I opened Grandpa's notebook again, the one he kept hidden behind tax records and old manuals. I reread pages I'd skimmed before. Observations about people, about money, about time. Near the back I found a passage I hadn't noticed. When someone rushes the ending, it's because they're afraid of the middle. I closed the notebook gently. The middle, that long, uncomfortable stretch where nothing seems resolved, had been the hardest part. It was where doubt lived, where isolation crept in, where staying silent felt like weakness to everyone watching from the outside. But it was also where the truth gathered itself. I thought about my aunt then, not with anger but with clarity. She had mistaken speed for power, control for security. She believed urgency could erase scrutiny. She was wrong. The truth doesn't chase, it waits. Family relationships remained fractured but honest. A few relatives reached out months later, not to apologize but to acknowledge. To say they'd learned something, watching it unfold. That sometimes the bravest thing isn't confrontation, it's restraint. I accepted those conversations without judgment. People arrive at understanding at different speeds. On the anniversary of Grandpa's death, I visited his grave alone. The earth had settled. Grass had grown evenly across the surface. Nothing looked rushed anymore. I stood there quietly, hands in my pockets, and spoke out loud for the first time since everything began. "You were right," I said. "About all of it." The wind moved through the trees gently. No answer. None was needed. What Grandpa left me wasn't just an inheritance measured in dollars. It was a lesson in posture, how to stand without pushing, how to wait without surrendering, how to trust that systems built on truth eventually correct themselves. Justice, I learned, doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with paperwork, with patience, with silence. And when it does, the people who were once dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated don't need to shout to be heard. They simply stand. If you've listened this far, I want to ask you something, not as advice, not as instruction, but as reflection. Have you ever been in a moment where staying quiet felt harder than speaking out, where waiting felt like losing? If you have, I hope this story reminds you that silence, when chosen deliberately, can be strength, not absence. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories about quiet resilience, delayed justice, and truth finding its way resonate with you, consider subscribing. Some stories don't end with victory, they end with dignity.